Tonight on Nova, are dinosaurs still among us?
The simplest interpretation has always been that birds are dinosaurs.
But scientists sifting through the evidence don't always agree on where the clues lead.
Then they're going to have to explain how you can originate birds from dinosaurs, which apparently can't get up in trees.
No stone is left unturned as these fossil detectives struggle to crack the case of the flying dinosaur.
Funding for NOVA is provided by Lockheed, a bold new force in systems engineering, management, and technology services for defense, space, and industry. And the Johnson & Johnson family of companies, supplying healthcare products worldwide. Major funding for NOVA is provided by the financial support of viewers like you. Inside this room is one of the great treasures of Europe. Jealously guarded for 130 years, it's rarely removed from its vault in the State Treasury Building. It is among the strangest and most unlikely of the world's precious antiquities. Not jewels or art or ancient documents, but something far more rare. It is, in fact, a fossil, the most valuable, enigmatic, and disputed fossil ever found. If it were for sale, it would bring millions of dollars. But its scientific value is beyond computation, because this is Exhibit A in one of the great mysteries of evolution: the origin of birds and flight. For the scientist whose goal is to reconstruct the history of life, birds have always been something of a puzzle. They are so unlike any other living animals. Who were their ancestors, and how did they learn to fly? Birds have scales on their legs, like reptiles, and they lay hard-shelled eggs, also like reptiles. These things betray a relationship. But how does one connect a sprawling, cold-blooded crocodile with a hot-blooded feathered flyer? That question has intrigued the historians of life for more than a century and inspired one of the longest-running detective stories in science. The first clues were found long ago in the Sollenhofen limestone quarries of southern Germany. When polished, this stone shines like marble. It's been a prized building material ever since the Romans worked these quarries 2,000 years ago. The stone itself was laid down 140 million years ago, when this region was a tropical lagoon behind a barrier reef. Over a period of 500,000 years, countless layers of marine sediment settled to the bottom of the lagoon, slowly hardening to stone. In the late 1700s, the invention of lithographic printing created a huge demand for limestone. Production stepped up to meet the demand, and unexpectedly opened a window on the history of life when the quarrymen began to find unusual images in the stone. Such things had been seen before, though never understood. But in the late 1700s, scientists were just beginning to grasp the great antiquity of the Earth, and fossils were recognized as messages from the deep past. At the time, no one realized just how deep the past was. That these were pictures of life, 140 million years old. That ancient lagoon had been a perfect fossil-making environment. The ultrafine sediment captured victims quickly and recorded them in extraordinary detail. One day in 1783, a fossil turned up that was like nothing ever seen on Earth before. It was the size of a small bird, but it seemed to defy placement in any animal group then known. Georges Cuvier, the renowned French anatomist, finally made the correct identification some 20 years later. The skull, claws, and other features were those of a reptile, he said. But the strangely elongated fourth finger must have supported a wing. He named it pterodactyl, wing finger in Latin. Soon another fossil from the quarry proved him right, a beautifully preserved pterosaur wing with the impression of a membrane. A flying reptile was an idea so bizarre it was hard to believe that such a thing had ever existed. But the limestone quarries kept turning up new evidence of what became known as pterosaurs, winged lizards. Pterosaurs have long been cast as prehistoric villains. But their image is beginning to improve as we learn more about this astonishingly diverse and successful clan. Some were as small as sparrows, but others were the largest creatures that ever flew. This is the upper arm bone of a pterosaur called Quetzalcoatlus. It had a wingspan of at least 40 feet. The size of a twin-engine airplane. Pterosaurs appeared about the time of the first dinosaurs, and they thrived for 160 million years through the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous periods of the Mesozoic. Then they disappeared, along with the dinosaurs, 65 million years ago. But if we're looking for the ancestors of birds, pterosaurs are a false lead. The proof is in their wings, which reveal very different evolutionary histories. The pterosaur's wing was a membrane, supported by a hand with a long fourth finger. But the bird's wing is feathers, attached to the forearm, and a hand with just the second and third fingers. Two different solutions to the same problem. So the discovery of pterosaurs did not solve the mystery of bird origins. But there were more clues yet to come. For 200 years, the Sollenhofen stone cutters have kept an eye out for fossils. Selling them on the black market is a way to make some extra money. In 1860, the local doctor was Carl Haberlein. At his home near the quarries, he accepted fossils as payment for medical treatment. And one day he came into possession of something very strange. It had a long, bony tail, like a reptile. But among the jumbled bones were impressions of feathers. Whatever it was seemed to be part reptile and part bird. It was given the Latin name Archaeopteryx lithographica, ancient wing from lithographic limestone. In 1877, the same quarries produced a second Archaeopteryx, the one now locked in the Berlin vault, an exquisite specimen with clearly defined wings and a jaw full of sharp reptilian teeth. The timing couldn't have been better for Charles Darwin, who had just published The Origin of Species, proposing that all forms of life were derived from earlier forms. He was being challenged to prove it with evidence of intermediate forms, the missing links between major classes of animals.
There was a problem, in a sense, posed by birds, because birds didn't seem to be particularly similar, particularly like any of the other animals that laid eggs, crocodiles.
Evolutionary biologist Jacques Gautier.
They seem to be off there out by themselves, and probably next to the question of the origin of humans, the origin of birds is probably one of the most serious impediments to a general acceptance of Darwin's idea of the transmutation of species. Well, just a few years after the publication of The Origin of Species, Darwin had his first and perhaps greatest triumph in the sense that Archaeopteryx lithographica was found. It clearly had feathers like modern birds, but it had teeth and a long tail, features that no living bird has. It was intermediate in form, and it was exactly what Darwin predicted. He said, yes, things may be very different when they're alive today, or very distant from a common ancestor. But as you go back down their lines, or earlier and earlier in time, you will eventually converge on a form. And Archaeopteryx was a perfect test of that.
It was a clear case of evolution caught in the act. The problem for science now was not whether birds had descended from reptiles, but which reptile. A young scientist named Thomas Huxley proposed a startling solution to the mystery. Perhaps birds were descended from the dinosaurs. Huxley knew that some dinosaurs were upright bipedal walkers. He noticed that flightless birds like the ostrich resembled certain dinosaurs in the legs and feet. And he knew of one dinosaur as small as a chicken called Compsognathus, from the same quarry as Archaeopteryx. But Huxley's case for a dinosaur origin of birds had one major weakness.
1869, before the Geological Society in London, he lists 12 characteristics that birds and dinosaurs share that crocodiles do not. In the back of the audience is George Seeley. And at the end of this lecture, George says, well, isn't it possible that the reason birds and dinosaurs look like one another is because both of them run around on their back legs? Not because they're related, see, but because they function the same way.
When unrelated animals evolve similar form because they have a similar mode of life, it's called convergence, a common phenomenon in the history of life. But it can be difficult to prove or disprove, and Huxley's theory became widely accepted in the 19th century. But the convergence argument made a strong comeback in 1927 in The Origin of Birds by Gerhard Heilmann. He agreed that some dinosaurs looked a lot like birds, but argued that they were too specialized in their anatomy to be the ancestors of birds. Any similarities must be due to bipedal posture. The true avian ancestor would be found further back in time among the thecodonts, the ancestral stock of primitive reptiles which also gave rise to the dinosaurs, pterosaurs, and crocodiles. Birds may have shared a common ancestor with dinosaurs, but they evolved on a separate line, more like cousins than direct descendants. Heilmann's argument won the day. Case closed. Or was it? "50 years later, a new piece of evidence came to light that would reopen the case. The expedition from Yale University was looking for dinosaurs, and what they found revolutionized our view of dinosaurs. It was a foot with a wicked-looking claw, which belonged to a small meat-eating dinosaur, perhaps 6 feet high. Expedition leader John Ostrom knew he'd found something important.
Its killing devices were on its feet, and yet it could only walk on its hind legs. It couldn't walk on all fours, and so you imagine an animal carrying its switchblade on its feet, and how do you use your switchblades on your feet? You've got to be pretty agile, and this animal certainly was. I call those claws, for which I gave its name Deinonychus, that's what it means. I call those claws can openers, because that's certainly the way they were used, to slice open whatever got in its way.
The leaping, slashing style of Deinonychus was a new image for dinosaurs. It had always been assumed that if they were reptiles, they were cold-blooded and sluggish, like modern reptiles, who derive a large part of their energy from the heat of the sun. Warm-blooded animals like birds can be more active because they generate their own heat, fueled by a large intake of food. Could the same have been true for some dinosaurs? The many different kinds of dinosaur are grouped in a few basic lineages. All the meat-eaters, from the giant Tyrannosaurus rex to the many smaller types, belong to the lineage known as theropod dinosaurs. Ostrom began to suspect that some of these smaller theropods might have been more like birds than reptiles. Quick, agile, maybe even warm-blooded. Then a chance discovery revealed another connection between birds and dinosaurs. In a Dutch museum, Ostrom found a fragmentary fossil of what was supposed to be a pterosaur from the limestone quarries of Germany.
And I picked it up and I looked at it for a second. And I said, that's not a pterosaur. It's not a pterosaur at all. No way. And I said, well, what is it? And it took me a minute or two to figure out all of the anatomical features that were preserved on these two small slabs of limestone. And all of a sudden I realized, coming from Solenhofen limestone, it could be Archaeopteryx. And then I said, wait a minute, I've seen that same kind of anatomical configuration before. And of course it flashed through my head right away. I've seen it in Deinonychus, and I've seen it in several other of the small carnivorous dinosaurs. So then I said, well, how do I tell which it is? I was really not distraught, but I couldn't tell at that moment whether I had Archaeopteryx or whether I had a small carnivorous dinosaur. And I said, does it have any feathers? And I tipped it up at a low-angle light to see if there were any feather impressions there, and there were.
Ostrom left the museum with Archaeopteryx in a shoebox, insured for $1 million. Back at Yale, he began a detailed study of all the Archaeopteryx specimens. To Ostrom's eye, it began to look less and less like a bird, and more like a dinosaur with feathers. The first thing he noticed were the hands. Except for the difference in size, the fingers and claws of Archaeopteryx and Deinonychus seemed very similar. In the wrists of both he found a half-moon-shaped bone, a feature thought to occur only in birds. Further up the arm he saw similar shape and proportions in the large bones. Throughout the skeleton, in the shoulder, hips, legs, ankles, and feet, Ostrom found strong resemblances to one or another theropod dinosaur. In a series of papers, he documented dozens of detailed similarities. Far too many, he argued, to be the result of convergence. According to Ostrom, Huxley was right. Birds are direct descendants of dinosaurs, which could mean that dinosaurs did not go extinct after all. They are still with us today, but we call them birds. The idea was so appealing and the case was so thoroughly made that it soon became the mainstream view among dinosaur paleontologists. It's an almost irresistible notion. Dinosaurs, no longer a cold, ancient mystery, but a diverse and colorful clan, still thriving in our midst. Since Ostrom's discovery, 2 more Archaeopteryx have been found in the Solnhofen limestones. One had been misidentified as a small dinosaur for 20 years. The other was discovered in 1988. Both seem to confirm a close relationship between birds and dinosaurs. One of the strongest promoters of that view is a former student of Ostrom's, Kevin Padian.
Well, I think over the past 10 years, the question has evolved from being a debate that's been fully open and explored in all of its possibilities to one that's been pretty well resolved on the basis of as much evidence as people have been able to gather in 10 years. I think that at this point we have a clearer view of the ancestry of birds than we have of any evolutionary question.
But the dinosaur-bird connection is less popular with fossil bird experts like Larry Martin, who think the dinosaur people have embraced an attractive idea too easily.
It's probably a bad thing in science when all the scientists can agree on something. Because the most horrible mistakes, if you look historically, you'll find out the most horrible mistakes generally had wide agreement.
Martin points out that almost all the dinosaurs used to support the theory appeared in the Cretaceous, as much as 70 million years after Archaeopteryx, supposedly their descendant. Defenders of the theory attribute this to gaps in the fossil record.
Although ultimately we'd like to go back to the fossil record and say, well, can we find any evidence of these characters coming up in the fossil record before Archaeopteryx? Still, the fact is that all these things that are from the later Cretaceous have ancestors that reach back into the late Jurassic, where Archaeopteryx comes from. So it doesn't make any difference, really.
As a former believer in the dinosaur-bird hypothesis, Martin once accepted that argument, but a closer look at the evidence made him change his mind.
Every time that I've looked at a line of evidence that's been proposed for theropod origins, I found out that it wasn't right in some respect, that everything looks like it's bad. And the fact of the matter is that I personally am unaware of any significant body of characters that support a theropod origin of birds that aren't in serious doubt that they're the same characters that birds have.
For instance, the half-moon-shaped bones Ostrom found in the wrists of his dinosaur Deinonychus and Archaeopteryx. Martin says they only look similar. The primitive reptile stock, from which dinosaurs and birds evolved, had a complex wrist with many bones. Ostrom says the half-moon bone in the simplified wrist of Deinonychus evolved from a certain bone in the primitive wrist, and that this character was passed along through Archaeopteryx to modern birds. But according to Martin, the half-moon bone in a bird's wrist actually evolved from a different primitive bone. If birds and dinosaurs have different bones in their wrists, they must have followed separate lines of evolution from the primitive ancestor. And the functions of the wrists were also different.
He described Deinonychus as holding its hands sort of like this. And the movement on the wrist that he described was a movement like this. Well, this makes a lot of sense if you're a predatory dinosaur. You know, you get a hold of something, you want to eat it. You can pick it up, and then you can turn the hand and put it in your mouth. Birds aren't able to put things in their mouths at all that way. This would be no use to a bird at all. What birds do is that when they fold their wings against their body, they actually have the arm in this posture. Well, the main wing feathers, the flight feathers, are sticking straight down. They'd be dragging the ground in this posture. So what they do is they take the hand and they rotate it like this, and this tucks the feathers in against the body. Well, this is a motion be absolutely useless to a dinosaur, and I'd be greatly surprised if any of them had it.
Martin is thoroughly unconvinced by the dinosaur origin of birds and argues, like Heilmann, that the bird line actually arose far back in the Triassic, before the dinosaurs. In fact, he suspects that birds are closer to the crocodile line than to dinosaurs, but he doesn't expect to find flying alligators in the fossil record.
Nobody, including myself, is claiming that birds are directly derived from crocodilians. What we're really arguing is that crocodilians and birds share a close common ancestor very early in their history, and this would just simply be a closer common ancestor than they share with, say, dinosaurs, so that the proto-bird, whatever it is not going to look like an alligator.
Well, I think that there's disagreement about the interpretation of certain features of the evidence. But here you see, when a case has been put forward very explicitly as the dinosaur origin hypothesis has been done, and there's several hundred different kinds of shared derived evolutionary characters that support the idea that birds are just small carnivorous dinosaurs that evolve flight. I think it really is incumbent at this point on someone who says, well, I have a better idea, to come forth with that and use the same methods and show that another hypothesis using the same evidence and additional evidence explains all the evidence better. That's the way science works. It works by method. And we have to agree on a method. The method people are using is the method of using shared derived evolutionary characters.
The method is called cladistics, a systematic approach to sorting out relationships based on shared characteristics. These animals are more closely related to each other than any of them are to the dragonfly because they all have backbones, and the dragonfly does not. These three are more closely related to each other than to the fish because they all have 4 bony limbs. And these two are closer still because only they have feathers. The results are plotted on a branching diagram called a cladogram.
Most of the features that you have are inherited from very distant ancestors. And only a few features are really unique to you. And if we wanted to find you plus your descendants, we'd have to use those unique features that arose just with you and are carried on by your descendants, and not the features that you inherited from very distant ancestors. You wouldn't want to say you're related to an ape because both of us have 5 fingers, because, gee, so does a lizard, so does a turtle. All right? You'd want to say that we're related to the great apes because we both lack tails, and we're big.
To find the closest relative of birds, Gautier programs his computer with hundreds of characters that, in his judgment, are found in modern birds, Archaeopteryx, dinosaurs, and various reptiles. The computer then sorts through all the evidence supplied by Gautier to determine who's most closely related to whom.
And there it is.
The computer says that Archaeopteryx' closest relative was Deinonychus, which was itself derived from other dinosaurs, and birds are the continuation of that line. This comes as no surprise to Gautier.
The simplest interpretation for all the evidence has always been that birds are dinosaurs.
Well, I don't have anything at all against either Cladus or cladistics. I am a little bit upset by rather dogmatic statements that are sometimes made by people that would sort of imply that because you do a cladistic analysis that you've come up with truth. Empirically, you know that's not true, because if you look at perfectly good cladus that work on the same group, they all come up with different cladograms. You know that at best only one of those cladograms can be correct. Now, the reason for this is probably has to do with how carefully people analyze and choose the characters that go into the cladograms. If you put garbage into a cladogram, you're going to get garbage out.
Well, they're welcome to their point of view, but they may have another agenda. They may not like cladistic analysis, as you pointed out. They may not want to think about birds as being dinosaurs. They may really think that birds must be more ancient and they must come from the fire. I mean, there's always something that makes people, there's something lying behind why people have ideas.
Martin would agree with that. He thinks dinosaur paleontologists have a strong motive to connect birds with dinosaurs.
I think that it's an enormously attractive idea. If you work on dinosaurs and birds are closely related to dinosaurs, then we might assume that dinosaurs had avian physiology or maybe even bird feathers. So we wind up knowing a lot more about the behavior and physiology of dinosaurs than we could speculate about otherwise. If it turns out the birds are really related more closely to crocodilians, then in fact it's very difficult for us to make any speculations at all about dinosaurian physiology and behavior. So if I worked on dinosaurs, I'd certainly be attracted to the idea that birds are related to them. And as far as the general public's considered, if I go home and I have a cage with a parakeet in it, it's certainly a lot more fun to think that that's a small Tyrannosaurus.
The idea that birds are direct descendants of dinosaurs has already influenced our view of dinosaurs. It's become a central theme in the public's education about their favorite extinct animals.
Look at his foot. He's got a bird foot, 3 toes in front, 1 toe turned back. He's got a bird leg. He's got a plucked chicken body.
It may well be true, but if it's not, we may know less about dinosaurs than we think we do.
That's why in this exhibit we gave them such fancy colors. We wanted them to look like a tropical bird.
Understanding the origin of birds will not only affect our knowledge of dinosaurs, it may help us to resolve another mystery. How did birds learn to fly? Many animals living in the trees take advantage of gravity to get from place to place. It's not hard to imagine a proto-bird evolving flight in small steps, from leaping to gliding and finally to powered flight. Feathers might have begun as a fringe of elongated scales creating drag, helping the arboreal leaper to slow down and maneuver, an advantage enhanced through evolution by even longer scales changing to feathers. This trees-down scenario for the origin of flight is especially appealing to those who see the bird ancestor as a small tree-dwelling reptile, but not often to those who see the ancestor as a dinosaur.
When you look at where birds came from, the small carnivorous dinosaurs were obviously animals that were good runners, They were predators. They ran along the ground. They flexed their hands. They, could use their arms in a variety of ways. You start thinking about possibilities for evolving flight from the ground up. And I think that's really been the sort of the tension. One group is impressed by what living birds do. Another group is more impressed by where birds came from.
The human broad jumper instinctively uses outstretched arms to maintain balance and stability in the air. The ground-up theory for the origin of flight applies this idea to a small, warm-blooded dinosaur already clothed with feathers for insulation. For increased stability in running leaps, it evolves longer feathers on the forelimbs and eventually adapts these feathered limbs as wings. But many find this difficult to imagine.
It's a little hard for me to see what real advantage you get in either flying or gliding when you're running, because either activity will result at least in initial loss of airspeed. So if you're being pursued, you're more likely to be caught. If you're pursuing something, you're more likely not to run it down.
Critics of the running or cursorial origin of flight also say that flight from the ground up would be energetically expensive, and it would be nearly impossible to get up enough speed to develop lift.
That would be true if we demanded that animals evolve all-out, sustained flight all at once. If you have animals that run along doing, leaps and bursts of flapping, and then getting back down to the ground, running along some more, jumping up, leaping and flapping and doing that eliminates that difficulty, because then you get a question of evolutionary improvement through time.
One point that everyone agrees on is that Archaeopteryx did fly. The evidence is in the feathers. The sign of a flight feather is the asymmetry of the veins on either side of the central shaft. This arrangement gives the feather its airfoil contour, which produces lift. And when birds become flightless, like the kiwi, their feathers lose this structure, becoming wispy and hair-like. This fossil of a single Archaeopteryx feather, identical to a modern flight feather, shows almost beyond doubt that Archaeopteryx was a flyer. But the skeleton of Archaeopteryx apparently lacked some critical pieces of flight apparatus found in modern birds like the pigeon.
They have a very large breastbone or sternum, at point at which the muscles of the flight apparatus attach, the power muscles. And also there's a special bone here called the coracoid, which serves as a brace, if you want, to prevent the shoulder region and breast region from being collapsed by the contraction of the flight muscles. Those are two very distinctive features that we see in flying birds today that are missing in Archaeopteryx. The coracoid bone is not shaped like that at all, and there is no breastbone at all. And that causes one to wonder just how well Archaeopteryx could fly.
The modern features that Archaeopteryx lacked are associated with the kind of powerful flapping necessary for taking off from the ground. If Archaeopteryx did indeed fly, yet lacked the flight apparatus for ground-up takeoff, why not assume that it launched itself from the treetops, even if it was a dinosaur?
Climbing trees does not seem to have been one of the things they did very well. That doesn't mean you can say definitively that they couldn't get into trees. After all, goats can get into trees, kangaroos can get into trees, so and lots of other animals that you wouldn't think can do that, do it necessarily for a living. But I think that when you start looking at the anatomy of Archaeopteryx and some of the early birds, and you look at the animals to which they're most related, you find that there really isn't a single arboreal character in these skeletons. In my case, as far as I can tell from the fossil evidence, there's no evidence that birds really spent much time in trees at all before the tertiary sometime. I mean, we're talking about after the age of dinosaurs.
Larry Martin agrees that dinosaurs were built for running, not climbing. But he thinks Archaeopteryx was just the opposite. a conclusion he reached while building a three-dimensional model of Archaeopteryx out of precisely cast bones that he made from one of the fossil slabs. The most striking feature of the 3D model is its posture.
When I started putting the bones together, I found out that I really didn't have a lot of options in the way that I articulated them. And I wound up with a posture that has the back almost vertical. Now, this was quite a surprise for me. I published other restorations of Archaeopteryx, and what I'd always done before, and what everybody else had really done, is that I'd kept the backbone horizontal, much the way that it is in a modern bird, or for that matter in a dinosaur. And this is something that doesn't look like a dinosaur at all. In fact, it looks an awful lot more like a primate. Now, I don't think there's any doubt but what dinosaurs were highly adapted for running fast on the ground. But this animal wouldn't be a very fast runner at all. What it would be adapted for would be climbing trees, because this upright posture lets the Archaeopteryx get a center of gravity closer to the tree trunk. And that's probably the reason why primates have upright postures too.
Martin's model is the first ever made of Archaeopteryx from actual bone casts. He hopes it will shed new light on some old questions about the origin of birds and flight.
Oh, I think that the long-term effect of the model is going to be that people are going to simply have to abandon the cursorial origin of avian flight. And if they do that, then they're going to have to explain how you can originate birds from dinosaurs, which apparently can't get up in trees.
Of course, Martin's model won't prove anything until others have had a chance to confirm or deny its accuracy. The way it looks may depend a great deal on who puts it together. But Martin is confident that his experiment will produce the same result, no matter who performs it.
Well, personally, I think they're going to be stuck with the model pretty much the way it is. Eventually, I'll be happy to supply copies to anyone who wants to try to fit it any other way.
Hi, everyone. All right. Who's first? All right. Come on, guys.
Finding experimental approaches to problems in paleontology is not an easy thing to do. Nonetheless, a team of experimental biologists from Northern Arizona University, Harvard, and the University of Montana is trying to do just that.
There you go. There you go. Okay.
All right, Ken, here we go.
They've trained starlings to fly in a wind tunnel. They hope that by learning precisely how birds fly, they'll be able to gain some insight into how flight evolved in the first place.
Okay, birds down. All right.
I personally have been dissatisfied with the various theories that are available to us. I'm one who requires to measure something and watch it move. That doesn't mean I get any better information than these excellent paleontologists that help interpret the fossil record for us. But I think by obtaining empirical data that we can really hang some numbers on and watch how these things act in nature, in other words, with living birds, perhaps we can get closer to the truth.
All right, here we go. You ready to record? We're at 30, ready.
To learn what's going on inside the flying bird, they insert a fine wire, the thickness of a human hair, into a particular muscle, and then record its pattern of electrical activity while recording the flight on slow-motion film. Combined, the data reveal exactly what the shoulder and breast muscles are doing during different phases of the flight stroke. They've also taken X-ray film to study the function of the skeleton during flight. This detailed knowledge of a bird's biomechanics will then be compared with the same kind of information about its closest living relative.
And we'll just let him get forward. Come on.
When an alligator walks, it uses the same bones and muscles of the shoulder and forelimb that a bird uses to fly. It's the basic reptilian design from which the bird's wing evolved. As the research reveals more detail about how the shoulder evolved into a wing, It may also provide a better understanding of what Archaeopteryx could or could not do, whether it was strictly a glider, for instance, or whether it could, in fact, take off from the ground.
We don't really know precisely what was going on with Archaeopteryx in terms of his function. We certainly have some good insight into its structure based on the fossil record and the limited specimens that we have. But who knows? Some more fossils may show up that'll help us. Perhaps an analysis of not only how a modern bird's shoulder works, but the workings of a variety of reptilian forms may give us some additional clues.
This work is still a long way from resolving any questions about the origin of flight. For now, the goal is simply to understand the problem.
All right, looking good.
You have to understand that you're talking to a couple of biologists, and biologists, by their nature, are interested in any living organism, how it works. There's nothing more beautiful to me than a flying bird. The precision that the wing must move under the command and the influence of the nervous system is amazing. And that in of itself, I think, is worthy of our study.
The best hope for new information about the history of life is probably the same as it's always been in paleontology: new fossils. Here in the panhandle of northern Texas, a formation of ancient rocks from the Triassic era has recently yielded a surprising new piece in the puzzle of bird origins. A team of students from Texas Tech University has been working a rich bed of fossils from the earliest days of dinosaurs, under the guidance of their teacher, Shankar Chatterjee.
Which brush? Brush. Oh, yes.
The fossil bones are scattered through a layer of mudstone, laid down 225 million years ago. Excavation is slow and tedious.
Yeah, leave it like this. Yeah. We'll find more, I think the bulk is still inside, so...
One day, they were exposing a new section of the bone bed, not expecting to find anything until they reached a certain depth.
In that side, bones really do occur in a layer, about 6-inch thick layer, and they do not occur below or above this layer. So we are pretty confident that we will not find any bones. Still, we are careful enough. Hold on a second.
Then something caught Chatterjee's eye.
Little bones. Yeah, sure does. He brought a little piece of rock full of fine bone fragments. They are hollow. Anyway, we thought this could be a dinosaur or not. We didn't know, so we put it aside.
It took months to remove all the bones from the rock matrix. But when Chatterjee began to piece the skeleton together, he was amazed at what he saw. At first, he thought it might be a small dinosaur, perhaps the smallest ever found. But when he started studying the bones in detail, he found characters that were more like those of a bird more modern than Archaeopteryx, even though it was 75 million years older. To Chatterjee's eye, this animal had vertebrae and a pelvis more bird-like than those of any dinosaur or Archaeopteryx. It had a breastbone with a keel for the attachment of flight muscles. And the skull had many qualities unique to birds, including a flexible upper jaw.
If you look at any dinosaur skull, what you will see, there are 3 holes here. This is orbit or eye socket, this is the upper hole, and this is the lower hole. And these holes are separated by bony bars or struts. So as a whole, the skull is very rigid. On the other hand, in birds, what happens, all these bony struts, they're all gone. So, since the bony struts, they're all gone, now they can really move the upper jaw very easily. No dinosaurs could do this. This is a very, very important character. And this is such an important character, I think I can separate any birds from any dinosaurs. There should not be any confusion.
Chatterjee is convinced that this was a bird. He calls it Proto-Avis. If he's right, it would replace Archaeopteryx as the earliest bird, and perhaps pose a serious challenge to the dinosaur ancestry of birds. Because Proto-Avis is nearly as old as the oldest dinosaur, and you can't be as old as your ancestor. No one is more surprised by all this than Chatterjee, who has always supported the dinosaur bird hypothesis. The National Geographic Society, which supports Chatterjee's fieldwork, asked John Ostrom to look at Proto-Avis and see if he agreed that it's a bird.
I reported to National Geographic that I did not know where else to categorize it. That bird class is the best I can do for you, but I'm very concerned, very skeptical.
With that endorsement, the Geographic Society announced Proto-Avis to the world. The reaction from the scientific community splits along familiar lines.
Sanker Chatterjee brought Proto-Avis to the University of Kansas for a week, and I had a chance to study it in detail during this time. And I think there can be no doubt that Proto-Avis is much more similar to a bird than any of the postulated dinosaur relatives are. And in fact, it may be that it's best just to call it a bird.
There have been many such in the past. This is just the latest one. New fossil finds have attempted to unseat Archaeopteryx from its perch for years and years. And each time, they are accorded a great deal of fanfare by people who discover them, and then they seem to disappear from the picture pretty rapidly.
In fact, when 3 years passed and Chatterjee still had not published his findings in a professional journal, many scientists grew skeptical.
It's really important for the public to understand the way science works is to come up with an idea, gather evidence towards it, and then subject it to peer review, criticism, and testing by your scientific peers in the community, which so far has not had the opportunity.
You should be very careful. And it takes time. It takes time to understand simply the anatomy. It takes time to compare. It takes time to, know why it is a bird, why it is not a dinosaur. And I think it is a bird. It is so far the earliest bird. And to prove it, I have to look for all the evidence. And that's why I'm so careful. I'm, taking so much time. But it is all ready, and it will go into press.
Chatterjee's paper has been accepted for publication by the prestigious Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society of London and will be out in the spring of 1991. Proto-Avis may prove to be a fatal flaw in the case of the flying dinosaur, or it may be just another false lead. In any event, the debate will continue.
Well, I think Sankar is in a difficult position in some ways because a lot of the dinosaur specialists have been very dogmatic about their position on the origin of birds. And because of this, it's extremely hard for them to back down. They're not going to like to do it.
That's the game of paleontology. You go to the field, you find new fossils, you change your hypothesis. We are really trying to understand with very little evidence.
In the Sollenhofen quarries, many clues still lie buried in the stone. Paleontologists continue their search through ancient rocks, hoping to fill another gap in the fossil record. And they scrutinize material already in hand, looking for insights that others have missed. But irrefutable evidence is hard to find. Some episodes from the history of life may never be fully understood. But whether birds are the children of dinosaurs or their cousins, the search for their true branch in the tree of life is a continuing process of discovery. And each new insight sheds a little more light on the stunning diversity of life. Funding for NOVA is provided by the Johnson & Johnson family of companies, supplying healthcare products worldwide. And Lockheed, a bold new force in systems engineering, management, and technology services for defense, space, and industry. Major funding for NOVA is provided by the financial support of viewers like you. For a transcript of this program, send $5 to this address or call 212-227-READ.
This is PBS.